Hi everyone, I want to briefly interrupt the new series and give you another one of my own games here quickly. I played this yesterday in the club circuit for my club Cavan in our match against Jobstown. My opponent was Senan Cullen and he opened with d4. I was hoping for a King's Indian and answered with knight f6. And he continued with knight f3, which surprised me a little. I was expecting c4. And this is an approach used sometimes by players who want to avoid the Nimzo Indian or see what you're going to play before they play c4. So I continued along the King's Indian route with g6, and he played the Tartikawa variation of the Tor attack, bishop g5, which I don't know well at all, so I was now playing over the board. And I discontinued development with bishop g7, and knight e4 is another way to play it. I found out when I got home and did a bit of research on it, but this seemed more logical. And he followed up with knight bd2, which is normal for this attack. I found out later when I did the research. And most popular at this stage is for black, just to castle. And I preferred to stop him from gaining a strong pawn center because this knight bd2 move has prepared e4, c4. So d5 I thought was a logical answer to it, and it means he has to play the more passive e3. And here I thought for a while and came to the conclusion that d7 was the right square for this knight. And because from d7 it doesn't hinder the movement of the c pawn, which is important if I want to maintain two center pawns after he plays later c4. I need to play c6, and I can't do that obviously if I've moved my knight to c6. And I didn't want to bring my bishop out first before developing this knight, because if I then develop the knight, it's blocking the retreat of the bishop, and things can just get a bit messy and the pieces again in each other's way. So I thought it was just better for coordination and everything like that to move the knight first, so that's what I played. And here I've got the idea of playing c5, and if d takes c5, knight takes c5 with activity. And if I play c5 and he doesn't take, I can follow up with b6, bishop b7, because this bishop's hindered slightly by this knight, then queen c7 and e5 as a plan to liberate my game for the middle game. And c4 is how he answered, which is a good move, I think, because it disencourages me from playing c5, which would open things up a bit too soon and favor white anyway, according to Fritz. I preferred c6, so I can keep two center pawns if he takes on d5, like I was saying before. And I was happy enough with this position. My only concern was that my knight was blocking the action of my bishop. However, here my opponent played the unexpected bishop takes f6, so after knight takes f6, I really had no problems with my position. It's somewhat controversial his giving up the bishop pair for no compensation. Fair enough, his center pawns are on dark squares, so it's not completely unsound, and he can now play knight e5, gaining a strong central knight that he can later back up by moving his other knight to f3. But his resultant dark square weakness gave me an instant strategical plan that served me well for the whole game. And here I was considering queen a5 followed up with knight e4. But I figured it didn't really achieve much after, say, for example, bishop e2 and just castling. They kind of like wasted moves. And I was considering also bishop f5 to take control of the b1 h7 diagonal before he does with bishop d3. And also to further prevent him from playing e4 with the pressure on the center, and liberation. If I take, then he gets a strong knight to e4. Things like that. And I wanted to keep my bishop pair, and I saw the threat of d takes c5, d takes c5, and queen a4 check with unnecessary complications. So here I castled before undertaking anything else. And there was the risk that he would immediately pawn storm and try and make use of this rook on h1. But I think objectively speaking, it would have been dangerous for him to pursue that plan. And I can open up the center fairly easily, and it wouldn't be too difficult to show that plan to be, wrong overall. But he kept it fairly calm and civil anyway, with bishop e2. And here I can immediately take the initiative due to his dark square weakness with queen b6, threatening b2 and pressurizing d4. and it's good because he's not even castled yet. So I'm, wresting the initiative from him at move 9, and he dealt with it by playing b3, which is probably not the best move because it further weakens his dark squares, in particular a3 and c3, and makes his rook a tactical target in some lines for my bishop at g7. And this is something I immediately took advantage of, maintaining the initiative with knight d7, essentially forcing him to trade off his best piece. If he backs it up with his other knight, I can give him double the e-pawns, just with knight takes, and if he recaptures, then bishop takes and d takes, and immediately I have a middle game target on e5 that's pretty much impossible for him to maintain because it's on a dark square. And if he retreats his knight instead, I can play e5 with growing initiative. So knight takes d7 is what he played, and I recaptured with my bishop, and then he played c5, which is gaining space and fixing his pawns on dark squares, which again makes sense given his remaining bishop. I answered with queen a5, again to stop him from playing e4, because I can just take now, because the knight's pinned, and with the idea of playing e5 to get, initiative going. And from a5, the queen is pressurizing c5, which playing e5 is going to undermine. If d takes c5, does queen takes c5. And it's all, very logical. And he castled now, so I began my plan with e5. And now black has an overall edge in the position. As I'm sure you know, an open board is ideal for the bishops, and this is one of the aims of playing e5 here too, just to open up the center. He answered with knight f3, so now I can force him to create a backward pawn on his already weak and attacked square d4 with e takes d4, because he has to play e takes d4 or he's going to lose this pawn on c5 to my queen. And this pawn on d4 is what a lot of the remaining play revolves around. First things first though, I took control of the newly opened file with rook a e8, which is especially good because my queen is eyeing e1, so I've got even stronger control of the e file. And my opponent answered with queen e1, I guess hoping for the exchange of queens. And this is an inferior move that I could have punished. Fritz preferred instead b4, where one line goes queen d8 and h3, still with an edge to black, about half a pawn ahead, thanks mostly to this pressure on d4. So queen e1 anyway, and queen c7 is how I answered, which loses about half of the edge I'd built up. And I like this move because my position was solid, there was no weaknesses, and his bishop was pinned now by my rook at e8, and had the prospect of doubling rooks because he's going to have to solve that pin. But Fritz thought I should have exchanged queens here, with queen takes e1, and best play in this line would go rook f takes e1 and bishop g4, with a big edge to black, nearly a pawn, thanks to the pressure on d4. So queen c7 anyway. Queen d2 is the move that he played, and it's the correct move to break the pin, but now I can get total control of the e file with rook e7, and after rook fe1, rook fe8. And now I have the idea of playing bishop g4 to indirectly pressurize d4 by threatening to take away one of its defenders. Ideally I wanted an endgame, a pawn up with my dark squared bishop against his knight, as if it was opposite coloured bishops, he would have good drawing chances. He continued with bishop f1 to try and relieve the e-file pressure, so I continued with my plan, bishop g4, and he played rook takes e7, so I played rook takes e7, which is much better than queen takes e7, of course, because now I keep the initiative due to the threat of bishop takes f3, doubling his pawns, and if I play instead queen takes e7, then he's got rook e1 with tempo. So that's no good. And bishop e2 is how he answered, which is an inaccuracy that changes the evaluation to about minus 1.2. Better, according to Fritz, was knight e1, preparing knight c2 to defend d4, but black is still better here. As a backup plan, I had the idea of playing b6, threatening b takes c5, where he can't take back with d takes c5 because the bishop takes a1, and he'd have to move his rook because of that, and I could create a passed pawn here on d5 as a result of that continuation, and then march that down the board as a plan. The problem with that, though, is the creation of a backward pawn on c6, which is semi-open file in his favour. You know, he could bring his rook to c1, and that would give him good counterplay. But as it happened, I didn't need to go down that route because my piece play against d4 was enough for an advantage. Okay, that's the end of part 1.